Thanks, Caitlin. Great. So I'll just wait for the first slide to load up. Fantastic. So, morning, everyone. I'm Greg Chambers, and I'm going to kick things off for Team 2. I'll start off by simply reading out what we thought were the key words from our challenge, so everyone's clear what we were doing. Okay, so the challenge was to help people understand how any particular item of legislation, such as an Act of Parliament or a statutory instrument, is structured and organised, and what commonly occurring key terms and concepts mean. And it gave some examples, like titles of legislation, how legislation is subdivided, how schedules are often used, and the relationship between subdivisions of legislation, plus how definitions are used and when legislation takes effect. Okay, next slide, please. So we started off by thinking about who our end user would be, the target audience, and we decided that it was any member of the public with limited experience of legislation who wanted to understand what the law is and what it means for them. And we decided that the product we devised would need to explain the structure of legislation at a basic level, boost the user's confidence when reading the legislation, and be engaging and easy to follow. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm now going to explain in a bit more detail how we set about the task before Freya and Annie show you what we actually came up with. So we looked at some sample pieces of legislation, asking the non-lawyers in particular to point out things that they found confusing or off-putting. We quickly found that it's indeed not clear to people what all the component parts of a piece of legislation do and how they relate to each other. And I probably should say from my experience, it's not even clear to all lawyers what that stuff's doing. But to take two examples that came from our discussion, is the stuff in a schedule law? And if it is law, is it somehow lesser law than what's at the front end of the legislation? Or even the contents page, is that just to help a reader see what's in the legislation? Or are the words in the contents page somehow law themselves and imposing legal obligations on people? So we could see that this lack of structural understanding is definitely a barrier to people understanding the substantive law. It makes it harder for them to figure out their legal rights and obligations. In fact, it probably stops some people even trying in the first place. So we then had a look at whether there are already resources that try to explain how legislation is structured and organised. And we found an understanding legislation bit on the legislation.gov.uk website, and some useful explanations on the Law Wales website, which provided some raw material actually for our product. But we wanted to present the information more engagingly and to get many more people to access it. And a final point on approach before I hand over is that we decided we should come up with a product that could be made publicly available right now, but that could be developed into something more sophisticated in future. And we had to think about what that future development could be. So I think that's a good point for me to hand over to Freya.
Hi, Annie, could you do the next slide, please? And so now we did a little explainer video to give a visual illustration of what our product could potentially do. Annie, is there a version with sound?
Sorry, I could hear it on mine. It must be because I was on mute. Let's see if this works better. Can you hear that okay?
No, Annie, when you share your screen, you have an option to also share the sound.
Ah, okay.
Is it in settings or?
No, when you click share screen,
Yep.
there should be a...
Okay, let's see if that works. Let me just click share sound. Let's see.
This is your guide to understanding legislation.
Nice one.
As you navigate an act, a voice and text glossary tool will be available to help you better understand the structure. In this example, we look at the Wild Animals and Circuses Wales Act 2020. The badge of the Senedd indicates that the Act has been passed by the Parliament for Wales. An Act of Senedd Cymru is a law which has been passed by the Senedd. Acts are often referred to as primary legislation. This is the short title of the Act, which tells you what the Act is called and the year in which it became an Act. The date of royal assent. ASC2 means it is the second Act of Senedd Cymru in 2020. The Content section lists all the sections of an Act, as well as the schedule and what they are called. It is essentially an overview of what the Act is about. Acts contain sections and sometimes schedules. There are 13 sections in this Act, and each section heading is numbered as listed in the Contents page. These cross-headings group sections together to give the user an overview of what those sections are about. A schedule is as much a part of the Act to which it belongs as is a section. Schedules are put at the end of the Act to prevent technical details from stopping a logical and easy flow of the main material. Why is Wales in brackets? This is an Act of Senedd Cymru and applies to Wales only. This paragraph is the long title, which briefly explains what the Act does. These are the words of enactment which show how an Act has become law. It has been approved by Her Majesty and passed by the Senedd. As we saw in the Contents page, this is the heading of Section 1. Here it has 3 subsections. The speech marks show that the operator is a defined term, a word given a specific meaning. In this case, the definition is given below. However, that is not always the case, but sometimes it can be set out in a separate interpretation section. Acts often give ministers or some other body powers to make further law, called secondary legislation, in the form of regulations or sometimes other types of secondary legislation. Secondary legislation does things such as providing the finer detail necessary to flesh out the law found in the Act. So, here we have reference to the title of a separate Act of the UK Parliament. This section directs the reader to the schedule, which is at the end of the Act and tells us the topic of the schedule. Every Act will have general sections at the end of it. Those sections will say when and how the Act comes into force and what the short title is. If an Act contains powers to make regulations, they will say how the regulations are to be made. They may also deal with things such as interpretation. So we can see here some details about how the regulations under this Act must be made. Here we can see that this Act comes into force at the beginning of December 2020. This is the section which says what the short title of the Act is.
Perfect. So I'll keep this section quite brief just because I know we've kind of gone over on time. But essentially, as we saw in that quick video, this solution would firstly be a sort of video guide that would be hosted on, or would look to be hosted on the Law Wales website, which, as we kind of saw, would be useful for those struggling to understand any structural elements of the Act, which is what we kind of wanted to focus on, as that's a kind of more general and could be more applied to other Acts. But of course, in itself, a guide video is also kind of a limited solution. And when we discussed this as a group, there are challenges such as, knowing where to find the video on the website, and also trying to navigate it in terms of, if there's a specific structural element that you don't really understand, having to flick through the video can be, quite time consuming and in of itself create issues. So with that in mind, in the future, we would hope that a tool could be created sort of off the back of this. And how would that work? Well, when you enter an Act, as you can kind of see on this slide, there would be a tool at the side of the screen which would allow you to turn on and off the audio and the text glossary tool. So when it's switched on, the tool would go through the text with a pointing finger and pick out any challenging areas of the legislation structure, as we saw sort of in the guide video. However, the guide video also obviously included a few examples that were specific to the Wild Animals and Circuses Act, whereas the glossary tool would pick out more general terms that would appear across all Acts. So the tool would potentially be a sort of an overlay website tool that would just kind of overlay itself onto the website, or sort of pop-up tool that would sit at the side of the page whenever you enter an Act. And as Greg mentioned, we did look at some similar solutions. When we looked for tools that kind of helped users to understand legislation better, particularly structural elements, these were very limited, and they were usually in the form of online guides. But the fact that there isn't a more accessible tool on the main websites where people are more likely to go to access legislation, such as legislation.gov and Law Wales, etc., it kind of shows that the gap is very real. But that said, some of the existing solutions are actually in the perfect position to work as a baseline for our solution. For example, Law Wales has a page called The Layout of an Act, which gives definitions of some of the structural elements of an Act. And as Greg mentioned earlier, we used this when we were creating this tool, because it is, of course, very useful information in of itself. But our tool would present this information in a much more accessible and user-friendly way, particularly given that our target user is a beginner to legislation, so might not even know that those guides and written tools are there to look for. So in terms of the feasibility of the solution, I mean, we think it's particularly feasible, mainly because we already have the example guide video that we've created. Obviously, this is just an example, but it is a good starting point, which could then be used as a baseline, and then create the glossary tool in the future off the back of that. As Greg said, we kind of wanted to focus on a solution that could have sort of an immediately applicable solution at the moment, which kind of is achieved through the guide video, and then we could work on the glossary tool later on. As well as this, Acts generally follow a sort of set structure, and this makes it much easier to design a standardized tool that would then be applicable whenever you open an Act on a page. Of course, I mean, one of the main challenges of developing this sort of tool would be the dedication of having an integrated team of software developers and legal professionals who would obviously have to work together and dedicate time to the project to make sure that basically all the definitions and information given are very accurate. But again, there are baseline guides there that we've used, which certainly helped to make sure that the definitions given were accurate for our purposes. However, when we do compare what is, I'll give you a little This is from Law Wales, so that you can just see the text written here. So, you know, you can see that there are definitions available, but obviously having a little bit of a more interactive tool would probably help with someone who is new to legislation and maybe needs these points sort of pointed out for them, really. And when we do compare what the solution would achieve with our end user goals that Greg presented at the beginning, we believe that it does hit the mark as it explains the structure of legislation at a very basic level by pointing them out and giving users the option of an audio or a text format or both. And it also, through this in turn, increases the user's confidence in being able to identify where the short title, where the long title is, for example, what the schedule is used for, where can I find it, that sort of thing. So it does increase the user's confidence in reading legislation later on. And it's also much more engaging and easier to follow than existing solutions. And obviously, if you are a lawyer, and I hope that if you were a lawyer, then you would be able to kind of figure out where you are in terms of how to understand the structure of legislation. These features would be able to be turned off, as we mentioned as well, so you didn't have to be bombarded by audio if you didn't want to be. But yeah, we'll keep it as that, and that's our main idea. We invite any questions that you might have, and we'll stop it there because, yeah, just in case of time. But yeah, that's our main idea.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Annie. I have one question. If this is a sort of low cost, high yield solution, how long, I know you were the person who made the video, how long did it actually take you to make the video?
Well, I mean, I guess the background sort of development took much longer than the actual video. So I guess the most time-consuming part is really gathering the definitions and making sure that those were accurate, which of course we did during this challenge. In terms of the actual creation of the video, not long at all, to be honest. I mean, it was only a 4-minute video. It took maybe an hour or so to do, an hour and a half. Obviously, you know, this is just an example. It could be developed further, and you know, we were limited to what Canva could give us. Even with our pro functions, we're quite limited. But yeah, it doesn't take long at all for us to do the video for these purposes, at least.
Okay, cheers. Does anybody else have any other questions?
I'm seeing a hand up from Dylan.
Hiya, thanks. Matt might be able to help here, but I just know from discussions I've had with Matt in the past that the National Archive have been thinking about certain tools that you could use when you're on legislation.gov.uk. So you know, one of the things that springs to mind is that if you hover your cursor over a defined term, that it would tell you what that defined term is. So this feels to me, because I should say, first of all, thank you for the presentation. As it is at the moment, it's a more sophisticated version of what we've got on the Cyfraith Cymru or Wales website, which, you know, I agree is useful, and it would be a better way of doing what we're doing. But I think the thing that's really interesting is whether you can replicate that every time you actually go into legislation.gov and open an act or open an SI. That's the thing that I think that would be the game changer. And so I'm just wondering how that could be possible.
I'm happy to.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, just since there was a specific legislation.gov. Since there was specific legislation.gov angle, I should say, yeah, thanks again. That was a great presentation. And it is an ambition, certainly, of the legislation service to provide that sort of extra context. We know it's a problem for readers of legislation, particularly non-legally trained ones. And I think, you know, you'd want to look at ways in which some of these descriptions could be triggered by, you know, identification of like language in the text legislation itself. So a defined term, as Dylan said, or like you can derive from the XML or the HTML now something as a title or something as a number or even a set phrase like the creation of a power. And was that part of your ambition to start thinking about how you could link like a hover over feature to sort of like tagging in the XML?
My non-technical answer, so obviously I defer to the tech folk, would be yes. Because a lot of this is quite generic, isn't it? What's a short title? If you hovered over, you can presumably tell the software what a short title is, and every time you hovered over one, you'd get the same explanation. It wouldn't be act specific or legislation specific. It would just say this is a short title, it does da 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 da, which is already explaining the structure to people and hopefully removing that initial barrier.
Yeah, I suppose you've got sort of generic response. I suppose like an early phase would be, yeah, let's just do the stuff that's like really easy to do, like that's a title, that's a number. And then I suppose you could look to extend to be something that's more tailored to an individual act. So I noticed one of the things on that video was that this is a section and it has 3 subsections. You'd have to look at the XML to be able to have an automated thing that told you how many subsections there were in an act, and that's doable, by looking at the data.
Mm-hmm.
But some of these responses are going to be, boilerplate, and some of them would be tailored to what the specific document's doing.
Yeah,
and that's achievable.
Good to hear.
Probably more realistic though would be, because I noticed that as well, Matt. You could have changed that video so that the text would have applied to pretty much any act.
Yeah,
and that might be, bearing in mind the scale of the statute book. I just think that might be more realistic, really.
Yeah. And we were pretty close to doing that, but we kind of ended our examples slightly sort of split into 2 categories. But yeah, we did think phase 1 would be try and do something that applied to any act. It might be that, well, the video that appeared on Law Wales or legislation.gov.uk could apply to one act because it would be an example. So if you're just watching a 10-minute video that shows you how an act is structured, it will be by reference to a particular act. So that would be okay. But phase 2, if you're actually having some sort of functionality that you could use whenever you opened a particular act that you're interested in, would have to be generic, I think. So that whatever you pasted, whatever layer you applied to all of these different acts you might open up would work for each of those. And then maybe phase 3, if you got that far, would be to add in some commentary on the actual content of particular acts.
Okay, perfect. Well, is there any more questions for Team 2?
Yes, I did have one. So this was concerning, when you're coming on the more technical element, when you're talking about, reading the XML to see the structure of it, I remember it was mentioned this could be supposed to be an overlay or some kind of internet plugin that's attached to your browser that does this. So if that's the case, what technologies have you looked into with regards to that kind of thing, is it, if any, or if it's just more, we know these technologies exist? And as an extension of that, if you're trying to analyze XMLs and whatnot, you'd need a guarantee of a format being consistent across all legislation, particularly if you're looking at a particular, like looking for a subheading, you'd need some kind of identifier to know that as a subheading rather than a general XML element. Have you looked into that at all as well with regards to that kind of analysis that would need to be done?
Personally, no, but it may be that one of my colleagues has a view on that.
Yeah, Greg, so one of the things that we looked at, to be honest, the general sort of tools that we were looking at, we started off by thinking about accessibility as a whole. So when we were really going into this, we looked at sort of the tools that are already available in terms of accessibility, and the kind of pop-up boxes that you get, that kind of shows an arrow, for example, to for viewers who with visual impairments and that sort of thing. So that those kind of were brought to the table as ideas of how we would maybe go about kind of creating an overlay, which is why I guess for the first stage we really did focus on the sort of standardization of being able to apply this to any act. So yeah, when we were in the beginning phases of this, we did consider the content, but that's very, very far in the future. And I think that the one thing we really wanted to focus on, just in terms of feasibility for this really, being able to roll this out, would be the standardization. I think we would have to go down that route first, where you would have to look at the, have identifiers there, which, could be done through tagging, especially since acts generally follow a kind of set structure. And you know that there's a table of contents, you know that there's a short title, a long title, there'll be a date, and these make it much easier to tag and then roll it out across, the wider sort of range of acts. But yeah, that's something that we would consider in the future, is how we would maybe customize this depending on the actual act. But in terms of the content, that's something that we didn't really get onto, as it's such that's something for the future, I think.
Perfect. There's been a few posts in the chat that legislation.gov.uk conforms to AKN, or Akuma Nitosa, which is a markup language, and it also I believe conforms to Crown legislative markup language as well, which is more of a Commonwealth sort of thing. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I did have one further, which was more, I suppose, going back to that first stage when you're having it as a video. Obviously, if you're producing a video, there's inordinate amounts of data that you want to get across with regards to that. As you suggested, like highlighting just Wales in brackets and an explanation for that, but you'd also want potentially an explanation for the entire sentence. And then if you posted this online in some form, how would you go about navigating that video? As you mentioned, it would be a difficult challenge, but how would that actually be done so that people would be able to navigate to the specific parts they want context for?
It is something we discussed. Did anyone else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think the main thing we discussed was potentially sort of tagging it, because it's, I know that you can do sort of timestamps for videos on YouTube, for example, and that's an easy enough thing to do. And that would essentially save the user a lot of time looking through, especially, for example, like our video was only 4 minutes long. But if you were going to do a sort of more general user guide video, obviously this would maybe depend on sort of where you wanted to go with it, if you wanted to be more specific. But if it was a much longer video, then yeah, like, I mean, personally, if I was looking for a particular bit of information, I'd probably watch the first 2 minutes and then be like, well, it's not here. So I think that certainly the first thing that we would do is probably timestamp the video with the information there, with the keywords as to what exactly, we're looking at in each section, just so that the user knows exactly where to go to. And again, they would know then if their information is included or not, or if they're just going to waste their time by looking at the video. So yeah, I think that's the first thing that we would do, is just timestamp the video with the relevant context.
Okay, as further to that, I suppose, then, say I don't know what I'm looking at. So I'm at a certain section, I'm a layperson, I don't know what I'm looking at. How would I go about finding out about what that section is if I don't know what it is?
Certainly in the second iteration of this, it would be okay, because you could just hover over it, and then you could depending on which mode you'd selected, you'd either have a video explanation or you'd either have a pop-up text explanation, or you'd have a video one. So that would be fully interactive. But that would be the second stage of the development. The first stage of the development, I think you'd have to look up a kind of index. Through the date stamp, through the time stamping, you could see that particular explanation appears at 1 minute 20, and you go to 1 minute 20.
Okay, thank you.
Claire's just asked whether or not Toby's question is about the subject of the provision rather than what type of provision it is.
It could be either. I suppose in the context of why I was asking, it would be the type of provision rather than the subject. So still talking structurally.
Okay.
Okay, well, if that brings the questions to an end, we'll just move the judges into a breakout room. Freya, are you okay to do that?